Brilliant. Thank you very much and afternoon, everybody. I'm just going to tell you very quickly a little tiny bit about myself. I'm conscious that I don't have ages and ages to talk to you. So about 30 years ago, I trained to be an early years teacher. And then I went off on a kind of random journey where I taught in all the other phases. And then 10 years ago, I came back into early years when I was asked to help to run my local preschool, which I still do. And that really kind of brought me back into the fold of the early years. I'm also an author, and as Liz said at the beginning, I've written about 30 books. And the reason they asked me to speak tonight is because my latest book is about learning behaviour in the early years. So I've got a copy here, which I'm just going to show you because I'm very proud of it. And I'm going to give you a kind of really brief overview of some of the things that are in the book. I also run training for settings as well. So if you want to get in touch afterwards to hear more, I'll give you my contact details. So that's kind of me. I'm a parent as well, but I've got two teenagers now. So I have an interesting conversation with them about self-regulation every time I'm doing a Zoom because they have to come off the internet. So let's get cracking because we don't have a massive amount of time together. So you can see my website address there. So if you want to get in touch, just get in touch via my website. There's an email option on there. And then you can also see my Twitter handle. All I do on Twitter is I complain about the DFE and then I complain about Ofsted. So if you like that kind of thing, I'm quite amusing at times. Right. I'm going to just give you, first of all, a kind of brief overview in terms of the kind of positive approaches we take to behaviour in our setting and the same approaches that I talk about in my latest book. So one of the key things about behaviour, and I've been working in the field of behaviour for 30 years, is to avoid being reactive to stuff. And what you want to do is get in front of the behaviours. And you need to let the children know how you need them to behave. Because if you don't tell them, there's only one way in which they can find out, and that is to behave in a problematic way, and then you react to it. And you want to avoid that. You want to get in front of it. So you need to be constantly having conversations about behaviour, because young children aren't the finished product in terms of behaviour, and neither are we as adults. If you think about your own behaviours, you probably find yourself getting snappy with your partner at times. You find yourself getting stressed, and that comes out in your behaviours. And when you think about very young children, they are right at the start of that process. They are literally learning how to behave. And so just as we wouldn't get cross with a child because they were struggling to learn to read or to learn to ride a bike, exactly the same thing about behaviour. It is just part of learning. And a really useful way to look at behaviour in young children, and in all children, but particularly in young children, is to try and figure out what skills they are missing. And often it will be around empathy. And this is something I think has been touched on in these previous presentations. Typically, children who have language delay struggle to express themselves emotionally. And so they will often have this kind of impulsive behaviour that you see simply because they can't express what they're feeling. It might also be physical needs. So often behaviour can be linked to kind of sensory processing issues, those kind of things as well. And where we can figure out what's missing, we can do what we do as educators, as practitioners, as teachers. We can put those things in place so we can support the children in developing those skills. Now, when you're thinking about behaviour, a really useful way to look at it is to consider that all behaviours are a form of communication. And probably just like us in our setting, you will be very big on communication. And I think, all the I can stuff is really valuable for this. But all behaviours are communicating something. And we tend to think about behaviour as meaning problematic behaviours. But actually, a lot of the time, children are communicating positive things to us in their behaviours. They're communicating that they're happy. They're communicating that they're engaged. They're communicating that they love you, that they're very attached to you. And the more we can learn to read those behaviours, the more we can figure out what they're telling us about the child. What does the child need? What do they still need to learn? So if you think about it as a form of communication, what it stops you doing is doing that kind of instinctive reaction thing that we tend to do. And something really useful to bear in mind about behaviour is that your instinctive response will probably be the wrong thing to do. So let's just take the example of a whole class of children. So I'm thinking about a school context rather than a preschool like I'm in at the moment. When a class of 30 children, and I'm thinking back to when I was teaching secondary, when they're not listening to you, your instinctive response is to want to shout at them, I can assure you. And you want to go, why won't you listen? But that is the wrong thing to do, because the minute you do that, they see that they can wind you up. Okay, and this applies exactly the same in early years, because our instincts will tend to make us respond emotionally when what we need to be doing is responding rationally. And the younger the child, the harder it is for them to be able to communicate what they're thinking and feeling. So this is why this bit is so crucial. Now, when we say that behaviour is communication, what we don't mean is we have to attend to every single thing that's communicated. Sometimes the best response is no response at all, or a very low-key response that encourages the child to self-regulate. So I'm just keeping an eye on the time here because I'm very, very conscious that I'm going to have to cram it all in. Right, so one of the things that small children and all children need us to do is be reliable adults. They need, when a child forms an attachment with you, they need you to be reliable, to be consistent, not to one day do one thing and the next day react in a totally different way. So effectively, what you are doing as the adults in the setting is you are drawing a line for the children, and you are saying to them, here's the line. Now, please make sure you don't step over the line. Okay, now I'm going to make you go back behind the line. And the more clearly and confidently you draw that line, the more the children will feel safe, because they will feel like you, the adult, are in control of the situation. So one of the key things to do is to constantly talk about behaviour. So we talk about our golden rules, and we don't just do it once, we do it, you know, at the start of the session, in the middle of the session, throughout the session, we spot these things happening, we have a golden rule of the week, and so on. Now, obviously, there's a couple of thousand of you here, so I don't have the chat function, but if I did, I would now ask you a very simple question. And the question is, do I come across as being a confident person? And fingers crossed, hopefully you would say yes. And you would have formed that perception because of the way I'm communicating with you. So where the adults look confident, the children have the perception of confidence and they feel more secure. And it's really worth having a little think right now about what it is that I'm doing that makes you feel that I'm confident. And it will be things like making eye contact, talking reasonably slowly, not doing lots of umming and erring, this kind of use of tone, clarity of voice. All these things will impact on how your children perceive you and how they perceive your kind of ability to control the situation. So we look confident about getting the things we've asked for. Yeah, I need you to be kind. We need to see good sharing. We need kind hands and so on. But we also need to narrate the why. We need to explain to the children and get them to talk about the why behind those behaviours. Why do we need these things? And that then leads us into developing the skill of empathy. Okay, it's all to do with discussing these things and being really explicit. And as part of this idea of drawing a line, you have to constantly go back to your expectations. Yeah, it's not a one-off deal. It needs to basically thread through everything you do throughout your day in your setting. You notice when children are doing the right thing. Yeah. Oh, lovely. Those are kind hands. Oh, I spotted you sharing there. That's fantastic. We even have a Golden Rules song in our setting, to the tune of London's Burning. It's not some great, wonderful song. It's just basically golden rules, keep us safe, keep us safe. So it's basically threads through everything we do. Now, one of the really important things with behaviour is you have to consistently model the things that you've said you expect. So, for instance, if you expect the children to listen to you and to each other, then what you can't do is talk over them. You have to model things, because the children learn as much through the things you do as the things you say. And in fact, it's probably got more to do with what you do than with what you say. And then you have to have unconditional positive regard. You basically have to send the children the message that whatever they do, whatever behaviours you see from them, you will still love them. You will still have this professional love for them. Their behaviour is separate to them as a person. And you do this through basically being unshockable. So, you don't overreact. You just say that's not appropriate behaviour, but you do this thing where you separate the child from the behaviours. Okay, I'm conscious that I've got 7 minutes left. Right. One of the things we're doing when we're teaching young children to behave is we are basically supporting the development of self-regulation. And there are 4 really key factors that for some children will not have been in place, perhaps in their very earliest years. And this is sometimes the case for looked after children, because obviously they have had insecure attachments quite possibly early on. So that attachment is crucial. But what's really crucial is that they trust the adult. The adult needs to be reliable. And what also needs to be reliable is resources. So the child knows there will be food on the table. And if that's the case, then they can deal with being a little bit hungry, because they know that when they do need some food, there will be food available. So obviously those children from homes where there is poverty and food poverty may struggle to develop self-regulation. What children also need is they need a feeling of agency. They need to feel that they are active agents within the world in which they live. And I'll explain a little bit more about that in a moment. And then what they also need is they need really high levels of challenge. And what can sometimes happen is you tend to get kind of 2 extremes of parenting. You get the kind of perhaps what we might call neglectful parenting, but you also get the kind of helicopter parenting where the parent over helps the child all the time. And that can also impact on the development of self-regulation. And often those children who've been overhelped will really struggle with failure, because they've never been allowed to actually actively fail. Right, so one of the things that supports us in helping the children move from us helping them regulate to them doing it themselves is the routines that we use in our setting. And the routines create this sense of security for the children. So again, it's back to, it's reliable, it's secure. And what you're looking for within your routines is little moments of agency for the children. And just to give you one example from our setting, one of the things the children do in the morning is they self-register with their names. So there's a box with their names and a little picture to go with each name. So the child chooses the picture that they want to attach to their name. And then when they put their name on the registration board, they choose whether to register for milk at snack time or water at snack time. And it's those little moments of agency within the overall structure of the routine which are really powerful for supporting the development of self-regulation. And the whole time when you're in your setting with your children, you need to be asking yourself, am I interacting with the children? This is Julie Fisher's term. Am I interacting with them? Or am I interfering? Am I over-helping? Am I over-supporting? And where you feel that urge to go and sort of repair stuff for them, first try to do a little bit of kind of verbal support. You can do it. I know you can. Yeah. And it's those moments of co-regulation and those moments where you give them time to come to things that support this development of self-regulation. Right, I've got 4 minutes left, so I'm going to whiz through the next few slides. Right, emotional support is a really key aspect, and the previous speakers have touched on this a lot, so I don't need to go into too much detail. But basically, the whole time you're in your setting, you should be naming the emotions you see. I can see you're feeling a bit frustrated there. Gosh, I can see you're getting a bit angry. And then you model how to self-calm. Do you know what? When I'm feeling angry, I breathe deeply. So shall we just try breathing deeply together? That's fantastic. I can see that you're calming yourself down. And what you're trying to do the whole time is you're trying to sort of promote this sense of, I can manage my own emotional state. I can control my own emotions. And you're also trying to promote an understanding from the children of how other children feel. And by naming their emotions, and talking about how does it make us feel when this happens, you are promoting empathy. And doing that thinking out loud thing is really crucial. Now, when I say don't be a helicopter, one of the things to watch out for is this kind of over-supporting thing. So it's where you go, watch out, be careful, you might fall. And a lot of parents will do this kind of instinctively, but we can sometimes get the habit of doing this as practitioners. So just watch out for that one as well. And then the other thing that we need to be doing is we need to be promoting both agency and independence. And there's various ways in which you can do this for children, but one of the key things is how you praise them. So try to get yourself out of the habit of going, oh, what a lovely picture, and instead frame it in a way that suggests that the child was an active agent in creating the lovely picture. So you might say something like, I really like the way you decided to use this colour. I really like the way you carried on working on that, even though you were getting frustrated. And it's all about thinking about, who's doing the work here? Who is doing the struggle? And children need just a little bit of struggle with support. We can't constantly over scaffold, because where we over scaffold and never let them make mistakes, then you get children who just melt down when things go wrong. So we need to allow them small spaces to make a mistake and learn to deal with it, and kind of pull back from that feeling of, oh my God, I made a mistake, I'm going to panic. So you're looking for chances to do that all the time. And then I'm just going to finish off by just talking really quickly about a needs-based analysis. So this is a really good approach to take if you've got a child in your setting who is presenting you with behaviour that puzzles you. So it's tricky behaviour, and you're puzzled as to where it comes from. Now, what tends to happen as practitioners, as educators, is we tend to leap to assumptions before we've actually spent enough time observing. So the first step of the needs-based analysis is simply to say, what are the observed behaviours? And you need to be really careful, because at this point you might go, well, I observe that the child is lazy, or they can't be bothered, or they're defiant. And we immediately start putting labels on things. And what you're trying to do is you're just literally trying to say, I observe that the child, every time the child sits on the carpet, they wriggle and they hit out. So that would be an observed behaviour. And then the next little bit is to say to myself, right, what might that behaviour be telling me that that child actually needs? So it could be that they need to be more active. It could be that they need a cushion to sit on. It could be that I need to do something with my storytelling to make it a bit more interactive. So by starting with observing, you can then pick apart, and then you start to think about strategies. And what we tend to do as practitioners is we tend to want to kind of find a strategy that will solve everything. And so we can be a bit like a kind of magpie with this, and we go, I tried that strategy and it didn't work, so I tried that strategy. And actually sometimes, and this has happened to us right now in our setting, the moment comes where you have to think to yourself, it's not about finding another strategy, it's about looking at our actual provision. What could we change about our provision to make it more inclusive and to better meet the child's needs? And often the answer to that will link into staff needs as well. So one of the things, just before I finish up, one of the things that we've discovered about a child at the moment is the child needs a physical outlet. So we've started going for more walks, and really helpfully that meets the needs of staff to be outdoors in the current pandemic situation. So I will stop there and I will say thank you very much for listening to my whirlwind tour of behaviour in the early years.
Thank you, Sue, so much. I think you've rounded off the session beautifully by giving some really practical advice and examples. We've had so many questions. It's been wonderful. I have no doubt that our main challenge will be to answer all of them, and we will fail, but we're going to try really hard now over the next few minutes to try and group some of the questions and some of the examples that you've given us, and try to give you a little bit more background to that. So I'm going to give Sue a rest because she's just talked so beautifully for a while, but you're not escaping. I'm coming back to you. I wanted to start really with, there's been a couple of questions around how perhaps you can deal with the support challenge behaviour where you're not clear what the reason for it is. So there are examples where children may have suffered a bereavement or abuse, or something where there's quite a tangible reason why it started. But for some children, that's not the case. So I didn't know whether, Sarah, perhaps I could start with you and just ask, when in that situation, how would you tackle it? And also, whether it actually is important to understand the why, or whether there's strategies you can do even without that context. Perhaps I could start with you.
Thanks, Liz. Yeah, I think that's a great question. And actually, I think actually it's more common that we don't understand what's going on behind the behaviour than that we do, and also more common that there's not a kind of one single explanation, but that there's kind of multiple competing or kind of multiple factors all feeding into creating this particular behaviour. And those might be things that are historical to that child's experience. They might be things that are going on presently in their life, and they might be things about that child's personality and about that child's abilities also that feed into that. So I think it's, in a way, that's the rule, not the exception. And I suppose I want to come back a bit to something that I was saying about sort of, in a way, accepting in the moment that you don't really understand it. So I think, leaping to trying to sort of say, oh, is it because you're cross, or is it because this, or is it because that? It's not generally not helpful, especially in the heat of the moment. And in a way that comes later when you've got a bit more time. So just to say something, Liz, about what you asked, is there something you can do even when you don't understand it? I think absolutely yes. And I think the priority when you don't understand the behaviour is just getting in touch with the feeling. So not the explanation, but what that child might be feeling. So, and sometimes you can do that by reflecting a bit on what you're feeling. If you're feeling really frustrated, perhaps perhaps that's what the child's feeling, and you might be able to say something simple about that. Or if you're feeling cross, that might also be what the child's feeling. You might be able to say something about that. You might not be able to say anything. It might be more about kind of a facial expression or a noise, or just something that communicates that you are trying to kind of get on board with that child in the moment. And then I think in terms of trying to make sense of the behaviour, it can be really, really helpful to kind of, in a way, put time aside to do that. So like I said, put time aside to observe the child at other times when they're calm. Allocate someone who will be the observer in sort of just kind of meltdown moments, so that you've got someone who's feeling calm, who's not having to be there managing the behaviour, but who can actually be thinking about it. And then the last thing, I suppose, it's touching again a bit on what I said previously, but children don't tend to tell us what's going on directly, and the way that we can understand that is partly through talking to parents. and families, carers getting a sense and building up a picture. And the other way, I think, really is paying really close attention to play. And I would say that's a really, really helpful tool that's there, that's around, and that's, there all the time for people working in childcare. So, really paying special attention to what the child's communicating through their play and trying to put that together with all the other help you. All these bits of information and thinking with colleagues and thinking with parents may help you to sort of have a working model that you can draw on.
Thank you so much. That's really, really appreciated. I know, Sue, you picked a little bit up on needs analysis, and I don't know if there was perhaps something more you could add in terms of how that might apply to some of these situations.
Yeah, I mean, it's basically an observation-based approach. And the really crucial thing to do is to avoid jumping to judgment. And that's the kind of tempting thing to do, is to try and kind of label it. And actually, often the answer, in inverted commas, to what the child needs is not something that's necessarily really obvious. So like I was saying at the end of my presentation about, we ended up figuring out that it was a kind of physical outlet need, which kind of seems logical, doesn't it? Because we've all been kind of trapped in environments at home. And so often the answer to the child's needs is around curriculum. It's not actually, because what people tend to want is they want a kind of consequence. I want to be able to do something because the behaviour is bad and wrong. And that's the kind of thinking that goes on. We might not perhaps externalise that. But actually, a lot of the time, all it is just thinking, how can we better change our curriculum to meet what the child needs? And I think what Sarah was saying there about play is, if you are starting from genuinely from the children's interests, and it's child-led, and it's, you're looking at their play, then often they will sort of express what they need in their approach to play. So they will make a beeline for certain things that tell you something about what they need. And I think observation is a really powerful tool, because often we want to be doing, and perhaps we don't give ourselves enough time to be observing as well. You're on mute, Liz.
Oh, classic. Someone had to do it, didn't they? At least I'm not a cat as well. That'd be even worse. So yeah, thank you so much, Sue. That's really added a little bit of perspective around all the other stuff that goes on in the setting and how that affects the children that you're looking after. I'm very conscious of time. I wanted to pick up on a few of the questions that we've had around specific examples of challenging behaviour that you're experiencing in your settings. And I didn't know, perhaps I would start with Sue this time and then see if Camilla can add anything to this. But we've got a couple of examples. I'm not going to go through all of them. Children who are biting other children, children who are experiencing the opportunity to spiral, as someone says here, out of control in terms of screaming for extended periods, children who perhaps have little in terms of language development, who are finding it hard and hitting other children. So there's lots of little examples here of really challenging things that practitioners are dealing with in their settings on a daily basis, and just really seeking some advice and support about those specific scenarios. So building on what you've already said, Sue, is there anything you would like to give?
Yeah, one of the questions I spotted was somebody where they'd been advised just to say no to the child, and that is probably the worst thing you can possibly do. If you find yourself reacting to behaviour by saying no, you are being reactive rather than proactive. So the children don't have enough clarity about expectations. So you have to catch them doing the right thing. And sometimes it might be a little tiny moment where they're doing something right, and then you have to make a massive deal out of it. I really like the way that you handed that toy to your friend. And the problem is that when we're reactive, what tends to happen is it's very instinctive. And so we're kind of in a defensive mode. Whereas where we're proactive, we're supporting the children to learn how to do the right thing. And it's not a one-off deal. I mean, I kept saying that, didn't I? But you're going to have to reinforce and revisit and repeat. In terms of the biting one, the last chapter of my book has actually got like a whole case study on lots of different things. And one of them is biting. Biting is really complex, but it's actually very closely connected to needs. And it's often to do with teething and those kind of needs. And my own child, who's now 18, was bitten by his best friend at nursery. And the funny thing about biting is that actually it's the parent of the child who has bitten who usually feels worse than the parent of the child who got bit. So that's all I'll say on that one.
Thank you, Sue. I don't know if perhaps Camilla or Sarah, you'd like to come in, because I know some of these challenges are fairly often the case that things are being dealt with in settings. And I know we've had a couple of questions about some of the strategies that we're talking about and how those perhaps apply to children with special educational needs or additional language needs. And I don't know if is it the same techniques, or the particular aspects that we need to think about more for children with those additional needs? I don't know, Camilla, you're nodding. Would you like to start?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So I guess the first thing I wanted to say or reiterate, because it's been said a few times, is just that lots of these behaviours are really normative, and we'd be expecting them in all children, no matter their kind of their context and the level of challenge in their life, whether that's to do with abuse or the pandemic, or perhaps having additional kind of language needs. Pushing and shouting and biting are all, fairly normal. I think people are bringing examples where they're very frequent and quite disruptive and perhaps not within a normative range. But we heard from Sarah how much kind of shame can get in the way, both our own and children. Particularly when there are difficulties from child to child, I think we're doing the same things that we've said that we would want to do, no matter the situation. We are trying to encourage the other children to understand how this little person might be feeling, and that they're feeling very cross, or that some other really very sad and some other kind of emotion, to help them connect to each other. Because often, as Sue said, the biting can be an intense display of excitement sometimes, not necessarily anger, and can often happen between the best of friends, and still happen habitually in a way that we wouldn't want to be happening because it's hurting somebody. But we obviously want to keep those little social relationships, to help them understand each other, and help them. I saw recently in my daughter's nursery the kind of counting, the breathing to calm down, the children teaching that to each other, like you're getting cross and so that regulation can be kind of in a group as well. I think of course we need to adapt some of these techniques when we're working with children with special educational needs, language delays, or perhaps have been identified as being on the autism spectrum. But I do still think, no matter the age of the child, maybe the language issues because they're a very small child or because of other reasons, I still think language is very important, particularly emotional language, and being able to name the things that children might be feeling in the same way, just trying to do it in a simple and clear way, particularly picking up on what Sue said, not focusing so much on what you don't want them to do, because that's a lot of words that perhaps that child will then be processing before they hear the things that you might want them to do. Kind hands, or having a picture of kind hands, instead of saying we don't hit. Of course that's true, but I'd focus in a moment of dysregulation on the thing that you do want. But I would say don't underestimate the power and importance of simple, particularly emotional language alongside something behavioural, because a lot of what you're trying to communicate will come across in your body language and in your facial expression. But and that's essential. But that connection to language is can be very importantly symbolic, and that language can be your words, but it can also be pictorial and through things like Makachon, which I'm sure lots of nurseries will use as well. Within early years in mind, we've got quite a large piece coming out about working with parents who have children with learning disabilities and parents who have learning disabilities themselves. So it's an area that's kind of been highlighted to us that we can do a lot more of. I think my last comment I would just share is that what we see a lot, particularly at the Anna Freud Centre, is people making referrals for perhaps an ASD or a kind of language delay assessment. And what we kind of find out is that some of those language delays might be about something that's more emotional, that's more around an attachment difficulty, and that child just doesn't have the agency or hasn't been given the scaffolding to be able to develop language in a safe way. And by creating a safe base, we haven't spoken that much about key workers today, but I think just, that was one of Anna Freud's, our kind of founders, initial kind of discoveries and assertions kind of post-war, creating key work as a stable base, and the importance of stability. It can just be hugely kind of life-changing for little children who aren't able to speak, to learn to speak. And so I would just flag that sometimes speech and language delays can be something emotional opposed to organic.
Thank you so much, Camilla. That's great. I don't know if colleagues want to add anything to that. I think we covered a lot there in terms of the perspectives of how to move forward. Are you both happy for us to move on? That's great. So I'm very conscious of how much time we've got left. I've got a couple more questions I'd love to ask. I don't know, Sarah, if you might be able to be willing. I know a few people have asked about what the language of safety actually is and whether you could give some examples of safe language. So we're all really keen to give us some scenarios. Thank you.
Yeah, I realise in calling it that, I've probably made it sound like a bit more elaborate than it actually is. So when I talk about it, I was kind of rushing through to keep to my time. When I talk about that, what I mean really is genuinely just the words safe and unsafe. And I find that those words are really, really helpful to children. And actually, I was thinking about this in relation to the biting question. It's really, really helpful to sort of reframe the reasons that we don't do things as because they're not safe, rather than because they're kind of against the rules, or they're good or they're bad, or even they're kind or unkind. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't teach children what's kind and unkind. We absolutely should, but I think, as Sue sort of mentioned, it's much better to do that in a sort of positive way, getting out ahead of the behaviour rather than doing it when a child is sort of overwhelmed and dysregulated. What I find is really helpful when a child's dysregulated is talking to them about not being able to let them do something because it's not safe. And I'm thinking about the biting example, and that, of course, it's obviously not safe for one child to bite another because the other child will get hurt. But it's also not safe to let a child be the biter because they don't feel safe if they bite. They don't feel good about themselves. They feel frightened. And so, what I find is really being really clear with children. I can't let you bite your friend because it's not safe for him and it's not safe for you. And I think that really communicates to children that what you're interested in is helping them manage their feelings. You're not interested in shaming them or sort of even necessarily sort of teaching them at that point. You're there to sort of help them feel that there's someone there who understands that they feel overwhelmed and who's going to keep them safe in the moment. So it really is, it's nothing more complicated really than that word, than it's my job to keep you safe.
Thank you very much. That's much appreciated. Is there anything more that anybody would like to add on that one, or I'll move to the last couple of questions, conscious of when we promised to finish? No? Okay, that's lovely. Well, I think we've also had a couple of questions around the impact that challenge behaviour can have on the other children in your setting. And I think we haven't really touched on that as much. But Sue, perhaps would you perhaps give an opportunity to talk through how perhaps you can help the other children deal with that challenging behaviour, how it may scare them, some of the things that might be reactions or consequences for children who are witnessing that challenging behaviour on a regular basis?
I would say one of the things that I would do with this question is I would treat it as a curriculum question, and colleagues will be aware of, the whole Ofsted focus on curriculum now. But when we think about curriculum, we tend to think about subject areas. And obviously in the early years, we don't really have subject areas. But, one of the prime areas is this personal, social and emotional development. So where you can come at these things through the curriculum, that really supports all the children to learn. So, for instance, when you're sharing stories, talking about, how a character felt frightened. Why do you think they felt frightened here? How might they have dealt with that? Because one of the issues you've got with behaviour is you can't sort of personalise it. You can't kind of go, oh, what should we do when Ben kicks off like he always does, as much as you might be tempted to. So you need to give the children strategies for dealing with that. And actually what I've found in my experience is that the children are often better at this than adults. And what we'll often get in settings is that the parents will complain about a child is problematic because they did this to their child. But actually the children can be really very inclusive. So for instance, in the past, we've had children attending our setting with really quite significant disabilities, and the children include them perhaps to a higher level than the adults. And so I think actually the children kind of naturally have that ability. So I think it just goes back to what both Sarah and Camilla have said about, talking through the emotions. How did it make us feel? But not in the sense of, how do you think it made me feel when you did that? Because then you kind of tip over into the shaming bit. The one really good tip that I always give to educators when I'm working with them is watch out for rhetorical questions. Rhetorical questions are an expression of your frustration. So you'll say to a child something like, why are you doing that? And, you don't mean it literally. And then the child will turn to you and say something like, well, I'm doing that because I'm bored. And then you're like, why are you talking back? And you get into these kind of exchanges which are completely unnecessary. And it's often to do with the way that the adult frames stuff in terms of their language. So I would say, if you're going to start anywhere, don't look for strategies to input. Start with yourself and think about how you're communicating, how you're framing things. And that will be much more powerful than a strategy X or strategy Y, if that makes sense. And think about your provision as well.
Thank you, Sue.